Hey, this lesson is going to be on the respiratory system and the structures of the respiratory system. So air is made up of many different gases. Predominantly, it is nitrogen, so 75, 80% nitrogen in the atmosphere, about 21% oxygen and 0.03% carbon dioxide. And then less than 1% are argon and other inert gases that don't react with anything and don't change at all. On average, adults have about 12 respirations a minute, which is about 6 liters of air exchanged per minute. The volume of one breath is about 500 milliliters, and then doing the math, only about 250 milliliters of oxygen is utilized per minute. The primary function of the respiratory system is to obtain oxygen, to allow the body cells to use that oxygen in cellular respiration, and then to eliminate carbon dioxide that our cells produce in cellular respiration. The respiratory system includes the respiratory airway leading into and out of the lungs, plus the lungs themselves. The gas exchange in the respiratory system make it possible for animals and humans to use food molecules and in cellular respiration. And there are 3 phases to gas exchange. We have breathing or pulmonary ventilation. So this is when we inhale a large moist surface area, our lungs is exposed to the air, oxygen is going to diffuse into our lungs or from our lungs into the blood, and carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from our blood into the air in our lungs, and then we're going to exhale it. We also have a tissue exchange site of respiration. This is where oxygen is going to enter the cell and carbon dioxide is going to exit the cell according to their concentration gradients. And then we have transport, where oxygen attaches to hemoglobin molecules on our red blood cells and is carried to the body's tissues, while carbon dioxide is carried from the body tissues to the lungs. The structure of the respiratory system includes the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx or voice box, our trachea, our bronchus and bronchioles, which are smaller than the bronchus. And those will then reach into all the lungs, where we have alveoli, as well as the diaphragm. So the nasal cavities are located between the roof of the mouth and the cranium. So it can be in from your nose up in even into your forehead. Air first enters the nasal cavity through the nose, where it's filtered by the hairs, humidified and warmed by the extensive surface area and the membrane-covered bone. So this is where we can each have swelling if you have a sinus infection, and then it's more difficult to breathe. The air we breathe is also sampled for odors using our olfactory receptors in our nose and sinus cavity. And on the walls of all the nasal cavities are projections called conchae, which increase the surface area over which the air must travel, which allows it to be warmed, filtered, and moistened, making it nicer on our lungs. The pharynx is a large air-filled cavity that branches into the trachea and esophagus, so it's at the back of our throat. There's that flap-like piece of cartilage called the epiglottis that we spoke about in the digestive system, which separates the 2 channels, and it will close off the tracheal tube during swallowing to keep food out of the respiratory tract. The trachea is a muscular tube containing cartilaginous rings with ciliated mucus-producing cells. Then this mucus further traps and removes debris, and then air passes over the larynx or the voice box. In the larynx, there's thin sheets of elastic ligaments that produce and vibrate sound. So the larynx, as it opens and closes, will allow different sounds to be produced for talking, singing, yelling, whatever it happens to be. Once air goes through the trachea, it branches off into the left and right bronchi, and these are the 2 major branches that reach into the lungs. Like the trachea, they contain cartilaginous rings. And then the right bronchus is larger than the left, because the left bronchus, the left lung and bronchus are altered to allow room for the heart. So if a foreign body is inhaled, it's incidentally more likely to enter the right lung than the left because of the size of the bronchi. The lungs are organs where the gas diffusion takes place. So oxygen will diffuse from the air in the lungs to the blood, and carbon dioxide from the blood to the air in the lungs. In the right lung, the bronchus divides into 3 secondary bronchi. But in the left lung, the bronchus gives rise to 2 secondary bronchi, again, because the left lung has a slightly different shape to allow room for the heart. The bronchioles, so we have our bronchi, bronchus, and then we have our bronchioles, which are smooth smooth muscle. They do not have any more cartilaginous rings, and they subdivide again and again, getting progressively smaller as they branch throughout the entire lung tissue. And the bronchioles are the smallest of the air conducting tubes, so they branch out incredibly small to reach all the parts of the lungs. At the ends of the terminal bronchioles are the alveoli, which are tiny inflatable air sac clusters where the gas exchange takes place. So in the alveoli, there is a capillary bed where we have oxygenated and deoxygenated blood surrounding all these little air sacs. And the average adult lungs contain about 600 million alveoli, and they're surrounded by surrounded by capillary networks to allow for oxygen diffusion and carbon dioxide diffusion. And the single layer of cells in the capillaries, as well as the alveoli, allows for easy passage of gases in and out of the alveoli into the capillaries. The walls of the alveoli are coated with a thin film of water, and this could create a potential problem. So the water molecules are more attracted to each other than air. And this can create a force called surface tension. So surface tension allows us to have that bulge on the top of a glass of water or liquid if you pour it really slowly into a glass, or to allow for like water striders, or to skid on the top of water, or to float a little paper clip on the top of water. And that surface tension increases as the water molecules come closer together, which is what happens when we exhale. Our alveoli become smaller. And if the surface tension became greater than the force of breathing, it would make it more difficult to re-expand the alveoli when you inhaled. So if the alveoli collapsed, they would contain no air and no oxygen to diffuse into the blood. And if re-expansion is more difficult, it would be very, very difficult or nearly impossible to breathe air into those air sacs. So try and separate like two pieces of wet glass. Like you can slide them on each other, but you really can't peel them apart. Fortunately, the way our alveoli are designed, they do not collapse because lungs produce a substance called surfactant that then releases that surface tension. And you can have a collapsed lung, but this is often a due to medical trauma, not to like I exhaled too hard. So surrounding the lungs is something known as the pleural membrane. So this surrounds each lobe of the lungs, and again, it's filled with fluids that reduce friction of the lungs on the chest cavity during inhalation. So as our lungs expand and contract, they'll slide up against the inside of the chest cavity, and we don't want any friction. We don't want to have inflammation of our lungs. So a hole in the pleural cavity is called a pneumothorax, which then will cause a collapsed lung. Which makes it impossible for the chest cavity to establish pressure differences. So because we don't have a difference in pressure between inside and outside the lung, now that lung will collapse. Those alveoli will stick together, and it makes it very hard to inhale. When we're talking about inhalation and exhalation and our lungs, we want to talk about respiratory volume and all the different components of that. So our tidal volume is the amount of air that's inhaled and exhaled in a normal breathing movement. So when we're normally just walking around, sitting, laying on the couch, whatever it happens to be, our normal breathing motion. We have an inspiratory reserve volume, which is additional air that can be taken into the lungs beyond regular tidal breathing. So now imagine if you're going to be holding your breath underwater, you're going to be like practice. Take a really big breath and hold it in. Now, this is more than the normal amount that you would ever inhale on a normal breath, so it's our inspiratory reserve volume. We can also have an expiratory reserve volume, which is additional air that can be forced out of the lungs beyond regular breathing. So if you were exhaling as much as you could until you can't exhale anymore, or say if you fell on your back and you had the wind knocked out of you, right? So a little bit of extra air came out of your lungs because of an external pressure. So our vital capacity is the total amount of gas that can be moved in or out of our lungs. So this is our tidal volume plus our inspiratory reserve volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. And as always, there's a residual volume that's left in the lungs after a full exhalation, again, to keep those alveoli from collapsing on themselves. So we can see our tidal volume in the middle as that squiggly little red line, which is quite a small amount compared to our total lung volume. Then we have our inspiratory capacity up to the very top, our expiratory reserve volume that low red line almost down to the bottom. And then we have that little bit at the bottom that's the residual volume that keeps our alveoli from collapsing and keeps our lungs inflated. Now we're going to look at the parts of the respiratory system that can control our breathing. So when we're looking at a respiratory system, we want to look at the pressure difference between the inside of our lungs and the outside of our lungs. And this is what determines whether gases are going to flow in or out of the lungs. So in general, the atmospheric pressure remains relatively constant, but the pressure inside our chest cavity varies. So gas in general is going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So our lungs control this partially using the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a band of muscles that separates the chest cavity from the digestive cavity. And our diaphragm on an in-breath will move, on an out-breath, will move upwards into our chest cavity, which is going to increase the pressure in our lungs, moving air from the lungs to the atmosphere. During inhalation, the diaphragm is going to contract downwards, expanding the volume of our chest cavity. It's going to decrease the pressure in our lungs, which is going to cause air to go from the atmosphere into our lungs. So when the diaphragm contracts, it actually flattens, pulling downwards, increasing the volume of the lungs, decreasing the pressure. Again, air is going to go into the lungs. And during diaphragm relaxation, it's going to return to that dome shape, reducing the size of the chest cavity, decreasing chest volume, increasing the pressure in the lungs, forcing air out into the atmosphere. So if we look at the diaphragm at the bottom here, as the diaphragm goes down, it increases the chest volume, the lung volume, forcing air in. As we exhale, air goes out. As the diaphragm goes upwards, decreasing the volume of our lungs. Also assisting in control of respiration physically is the external intercostal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. So the external intercostal muscles are found between the ribs, and a nerve stimulus will cause these muscles to contract. As the muscles contract, the rib cage moves up and outward. So as the rib cage moves up and outward, again, this is going to increase the volume of the lungs. So as our diaphragm moves down, our ribs move up and out, allowing for inhalation because our lung volume is larger, decreasing the pressure in our pleural cavity. The internal intercostal muscles pull the rib cage downward during times of extreme exercise, which increases exhalation, which is important because it helps our body get rid of the excess CO2 produced during exercise, but they're not generally employed during regular breathing. So when we look all together at the mechanics of breathing, we have our diaphragm contracting and our chest cavity expanding using our external intercostal muscles, increasing our lung volume, allowing air to flow in. To exhale, we have our diaphragm relaxing and curving upwards, decreasing our chest volume, so our chest cavity contracts and air flows outwards. So that's our outline of the respiratory system as well as the mechanics of breathing. Hope to catch you guys next time. Bye.